Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. My name is Nancy Deutsch, and I am the director of Youth Next, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development. So thank you all for joining us for this webinar with the Center for the Developing Adolescent. Today, we're grateful to partner with CDA because they champion science-based, equity-driven innovations that positively impact the lives and futures of all young people. As we continue the COVID-19 pandemic, continuing this moment in history and thinking about back to school, we wanted to engage in a conversation with researchers and practitioners about how best to support adolescent development from 6 feet or more away. And as we know, many schools are now moving to being virtual as well as physically distanced. So we all know that middle and high schools teach more than just academics. And the social connections that happen in classrooms, in hallways, in cafeterias, really facilitate the social and emotional learning that are key to healthy adolescent development. So how can we recreate the social energy that is so important to those settings when students are at best 6 feet apart, or perhaps even on staggered schedules, or even virtually and at home on their computers, not being physically together at all? How best can educators, parents, and students work together to support the social relationships and experiential learning that adolescents really need to flourish? So these are the topics that we hope to discuss today with our panelists. We have several panelists here to help guide our discussion and who will briefly introduce themselves now. First, Joanna Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nancy. I want to thank Nancy and Youth Next, as well as the Center for the Developing Adolescent, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I have been for the past 12 years a faculty member at the University of Virginia in the School of Education and Human Development. And so I've had the pleasure of working closely with Nancy and with Youth Next, although I'm in the process of transitioning to a new faculty position at Rutgers University in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. I'm a developmental psychologist with a great interest in adolescent development, and I am really pleased to be part of this conversation. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'm Phyllis Fagel, and I also just want to thank the Center for the Developing Adolescent and UVA Career Youth Next for inviting me. I think this is a really important conversation for all of us to have, and one that we as practitioners, and I know for researchers as well, is a conversation that's very much on our own minds as we start an incredibly uncertain and unpredictable school year. I am a school counselor, a licensed clinical professional counselor. I work full-time in a K-8 school in Washington, D.C., and I wrote a book called Middle School Matters, and am a freelancer and frequently write for the Washington Post about teens, tweens, and the whole adolescent phase.
Hi, everyone. I'm Letitia Ross. I'm a research associate with Youth Next at the University of Virginia, and I'm very, very grateful to Youth Next and to the Center for the Developing Adolescent to be here to have this conversation. Let's get into it.
Great, thank you all. So before we begin, I want to encourage the audience members to please ask questions in the Q&A box. So if something piques your interest, you can ask us to expand, ask the panelists to expand on it, or to ask a specific question through that Q&A box. Please include your name and any affiliation with your question. We hope to answer as many questions or comments as we can at the conclusion of our discussion. So we'll go through some discussion and then we'll turn to responding to what has come in that Q&A box. All right, so as we look towards returning to school, what should teachers and principals know about the experiences that youth have had since schools moved online in the spring? Or what impact has been the last few months have had on adolescents? So thinking about what you know from the science and from the research on adolescence, how can teachers and principals best help youth to be successful as schools start? And I will turn it over to whichever of the panelists would like to jump in there.
I'm happy to jump in. You know, I think as we start the year, the number one most important piece of all of this that we have to remember is that everyone has had different traumas and different stressors leading into the start of school. So while everybody has been kind of pummeled by the planet, it's just been an incredibly trying time for everybody, and nobody is unscathed. There are kids who are going to have had more economic implications. There are kids who have been dealing with racism and police brutality. There are people who have family members who have been sick or even died. And I think that in order to be able to help kids access the content and reconnect with their classmates, we have to start with acknowledging and giving them a space to talk about all of those things that they've been through to the extent that they're comfortable.
I completely agree, Phyllis. I think there's going to be a lot of variability in how adolescents are currently experiencing the pandemic and their connection or disconnection from school environments. I think that there will be kind of a range of different priorities depending on circumstances. For some students, there may be an acute sense of, you know, feeling like their academic identity has been disrupted. For others, that may be kind of the least of their concerns, particularly if economic issues or family issues are more of a priority. I anticipate for some youth too, who are not feeling very well connected to school, as adolescents, they may find some sense of relief, may have found some sense of relief with the break. I think it's important to remember that just because the pandemic has shut so many things down, adolescents are still developing. So everything that shut down did not shut down developmental processes or did not really kind of change developmental needs as we understand them. So adolescents are still going to have strong needs for social connections. We know that during adolescence, connections to peers can be really critical and sort of reinforcing. So those are still important, in addition to connections with non-familial adults. Their sense of who they are as developing young people are also really important. So I think many young people are potentially experiencing a reframe of how they understand, you know, who they are in relation to others and in relation to the world, given the change of circumstances. Their need for exploration, their need for autonomy. I think that's something that I think we should keep tabs on. So with many youth and many of us being forced to stay at home, I imagine there's been a shift in terms of feeling like I don't necessarily get to leave my house and go out into the world and choose the spaces that I want to be in, but that's a core developmental need. There's also needs for young people to contribute and feel like they are being useful and making a difference. I've heard, you know, stories in the news of adolescents who've taken the opportunity to kind of shift and really work on, you know, leading activities or giving to their communities. Young people who've been involved in social activism too, there becomes more space for that. And I think those are all reflective of core developmental needs. So understanding those and prioritizing those developmental needs, I think, is a critical first step. I think, you know, we can talk a bit about the academic side, which is definitely important, but I do feel like the developmental needs need to be prioritized because, you know, whether it takes an extended period of time, young people will be able to pick up in terms of academic achievement and progress. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Phyllis and Joanna. Yes, I would definitely echo all of the things that you had said. There's been a wide variety of experiences during the trauma that is COVID-19, that it is wreaking havoc on this country. The data are pretty clear. I took a look in preparation for our webinar today at some data from the Pew Center, some data out of USC Dorn's Life, and the data are showing that youth are increasingly isolated during this time. And that's pretty broadly that youth are less engaged in school activities, they're less engaged in work activities, those opportunities, similar to the way that they are dwindling for families and for parents, they are also dwindling for youth. And as we transition back to this time, it's important to remember a lot of the things that you've already mentioned, but with a specific focus on connection and competence, and opportunities for youth to engage in meaningful ways. Be it virtual, hopefully virtual, as long as we're dealing with COVID-19, or when we do transition back to in person, to really keep an eye on that. Something that also really struck my, or I was struck by was there's some new data coming out of the CDC that showed, I think they collected data between April and June of a wide range of adults in the United States, but amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, increases in anxiety and depression were particularly high. And so this survey only captured adults, but if for young people, the experience of anxiety and depression are so striking, we need to be even more concerned for what's happening with our school-age children during this time. So I would say that, building relationships is key. Phyllis, you really struck the nail on the head. Maintaining peer relationships virtually. I think as we begin to transition back to schools, it's really important for practitioners, teachers to cultivate spaces for youth to engage with one another, to have conversations, not just about the academics, but also engaging in meaningful ways that they can continue to build friendships in virtual spaces.
I want to just make a comment, Letitia, based on your read of the data on increasing levels of depression and anxiety. We know from the developmental science of adolescence that this can be a period of vulnerability for challenges related to mental and behavioral health and well-being. As young people's bodies and brains are developing, it just creates so much change that depending on the circumstances and the context in which they're developing, that can exacerbate some of these challenging conditions. So I think, Phyllis, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this, but I think the separation from potential access to the kind of mental health supports that are available in schools is something to consider as well as young people go back to school. The other piece in terms of thinking about school leaders and teachers, we know that adolescents have great capabilities. So I think it's important to ask them about what their needs are and involve them potentially in some of the problem solving around whether it be a teacher in a particular classroom thinking about a plan for, how people will connect, or whether it be, a whole school or a school division trying to come up with creative solutions. Adolescence is a period of really kind of profound levels of potential creativity, just, again, from a neurobiological perspective. So I think we can tap into that and give adolescents some agency in the process, asking them for solutions, also asking them what their needs are. There's going to be lots of variability, but we can't make assumptions. I think it's better to go directly to the source.
Along those lines and along the lines of helping kids reconnect, and I noticed there's a question in the Q&A box about somebody who has a 12-year-old who is having trouble creating their own social connections, and the parent is having to initiate those interactions for them. And this person is wondering how they could help their child recreate those social connections on their own so she doesn't have to do it for them. And I think that's a question on so many parents' minds right now. I actually am the parent of a 12-year-old, so I really fully appreciate that question. And I think one of the things we have to remember about the developmental phase is that kids want to connect, they want to be liked, they want to engage, but they have very different capacity for it in terms of stimulation, and also they have very differing levels of skills. And so we need to be taking a really hard look at the kids in front of us, what they can do, where they need an assist. And as a parent, what I would be doing is looking at my child, and first of all, going back to this whole idea that kids are the expert in themselves, to assess whether or not they think that they're doing okay, to ask them, are you happy with the level of connection you're having? Because if they're relatively happy, we don't want to be shaming them or giving them the perception that we're disappointed in how little or how much they're connecting with others. And if they're unhappy, we want to be taking a look at what's getting in their way. And this is where schools can really be helpful. If what's getting in the child's way is that they lack social skills. Maybe they're the kids making the faces on Zoom, or they're the kids who interrupt, or maybe in face-to-face interactions, they have a really hard time connecting instead of impressing. And so add Zoom and the technological delays and the missed cues on top of all of that, and they're really lost. And you can, as an adult, and this is a benefit for parents right now, you can see that they're struggling. You can see that they're not connecting. Parents can give their child an assist at home without embarrassing them. You know, I noticed that your friend's attention seemed to drift. I wonder if you've tried waiting a few minutes before beginning to speak and then asking a question about something someone said, just giving some concrete strategies, but also asking the school, what are the options for kids to meet up with one another so that I can take myself out of this scenario entirely. Right now, it's going to be critical that schools offer brief, structured social interactions that set kids up for success. And I'm thinking book clubs, visiting speakers, Kahoot games, game nights, lunch groups with questions of the day, opportunities for kids to be with their peers where they don't need to be invited, because we know that the kids who are less outgoing or who lack those skills probably are not going on the Google Hangouts or FaceTiming with a whole bunch of kids at once. And so really asking the school to be helping them find those opportunities. And maybe there's even buddy programs. I think on the flip side, it's an opportunity for kids who are looking for a way to find meaning, to give back, and to, if they have social capital, if they have skills, to help kids who are more isolated or who lack those skills, and they can give them an assist.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You know, you all were mentioning the social issues, and of course that came up. And I think, actually, I don't know, Phyllis, if maybe it was you. I heard somebody say recently that there could actually be an opportunity,
yes,
for middle schools, because middle school cafeterias are such a scary place, that actually this could be an opportunity, right, for allowing.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's one of the silver linings of remote learning, that it's an opportunity for us to get kids to interact with not just the students who they normally would seek out and who tend to be like them, because we know in middle school kids are looking for kids who have similar backgrounds, similar backstories, but this is an opportunity in a less confrontational, less invasive, less stressful way to get different peer groups to mix. Because as I was telling Nancy the other day, to walk into a huge cafeteria teeming with kids and walk up to a group of people you don't know who are maybe older, or who maybe they're athletes and you're a drama kid, and sit at their table uninvited is incredibly intimidating. But now schools have an opportunity to say, here's this structured activity. We're bringing in a speaker. And by the way, it's also an opportunity to bring in speakers who look like the student body and represent that diversity of kids in the school, and invite kids to come and to get to know one another. And I had also shared with Nancy, there's good research showing that kids, once they're given that initial introduction, maybe there's an icebreaker, maybe there's a get to know you game. Once kids are exposed to kids who are different than them and that ice is broken, they then will on their own seek out those interactions going forward.
Great, and it's a great segue, because, well, the next, you started to cover this already, but the next thing I wanted to pose was, how can schools help do this, right? So how can schools help retain that social energy, either when they're virtual or 6 feet away? And I think that this extends probably to other kind of youth programs who may be trying to, a question came in about sort of an out-of-school program that's thinking about how do you engage kids when they may be online all day, and how do we sort of keep this social action engagement? So any suggestions you all have for schools or out-of-school programs in that realm?
Again, I'll go back to potentially involving adolescents in problem solving here. So I think when it comes to technology, many adolescents pre-pandemic were very adept at staying connected with one another, even at times when we didn't necessarily want them to. And as adults, we may not be as familiar with some of those technologies and, you know, ways of connecting. And some of them are ones that we might consider healthy. I've heard of others that, you know, can potentially recreate the same challenging social dynamics that you might find where there's opportunities for, you know, exclusion and inclusion and things like that. But I think a starting place is in terms of like the technology tools, finding out, you know, what are the ones that young people themselves in a particular community are using and enjoy using, and, you know, how they're staying connected to one another. I think another big part of this, and this, again, some of these things were true prior to the current set of circumstances, and that's about thinking about the relevance of school for adolescents. So adolescents have the need to kind of understand how school is relevant to their lives. You know, we can probably all think of situations when we were young ourselves or in interactions with adolescents now where they're like, you know, what does this have to do with me or my life? So now more than ever, it may be really critical if the physical circumstances are creating challenges where it feels like, you know, you don't have necessarily those same social connections. Then I think the approach to content is an opportunity to think about how is this relevant and meaningful to young people's lives? And then also thinking about what's being done during what we might consider for schools who are doing some synchronous virtual learning. How are they using that time versus the expectations that they might frame out for young people for what they do when they're not live on the screen? So for adolescents, that live screen time is probably not best spent with a lecture or something like that. That's something that, you know, kids can watch outside of the live hours, but using that time so that adolescents are like active and they're doing and they're connecting. In a lot of the tools like Zoom, for example, the small group breakout features create opportunities for you know, really getting kids feeling a little bit more intimate than being on a screen with maybe 25 others. But I think for teachers, and I am going to assume that all teachers are already thinking of this. I give teachers just the world of credit for having to navigate this. But I think, you know, if you're having some live time, how are you using that time? And it may not be that you're using that time for like direct instruction, but you're using that time for interaction that, you know, creates deeper opportunities for learning.
I love that, Joanna. And actually, one of the ways I think we can combine that need for that synchronous time to be meaningful to kids, but also help boost their sense of competency. And I know one of the things I think that was challenging with virtual learning in this spring is a lot of schools they didn't take attendance, they didn't have grades, it wasn't, for kids who are working really hard, there wasn't a lot of benefit for them for doing so. And of course, it made sense for equity reasons to do it that way. But the big question going into the fall is, how do you create an environment where there are expectations and kids do build that sense of competency, which requires us to layer some expectations on them, while also helping them stay engaged and excited. And along the lines of what you were just sharing about using that time in a meaningful way, I think we should really be looking at how we can get kids to teach their peers, to help them learn about something that gets them really enthusiastic, that touches on a passion that they have, and really engage them in helping be one of the teachers in that session. I think that that's something that we can use this time to do, or maybe even to support a peer in one of those breakout rooms. Of course, the counselor in me is a little concerned about the whole breakout room concept for a lot of reasons, particularly for kids who have learning differences and who might be targeted, or who have any kind of difference and might be targeted. I think some schools are better funded and are able to have those Zoom rooms be facilitated. In the absence of that, I do think teachers need to make sure that they're jumping in and out of those rooms and making sure that everything is going as planned. And I think also we need to be looking at the technology as simply a tool. The technology is just how we're reaching them, But then all of the things that we use to connect with kids, to make them feel good about themselves, to make them want to take care of the more vulnerable kids in the community, to make them want to delve deeper into a topic, that's where we can all draw on what we already know from working with adolescents. And that's not reinventing the wheel. And I think sometimes everybody gets really overwhelmed thinking about all of the tools they have to learn, when the hardest tools to master, they've already mastered. They're going to be using all of those same strategies. It's just a matter of how do we do that virtually.
I love those ideas. I've definitely been thinking about this question in terms of breakout rooms and how teachers can manage some of the content that's discussed in those breakout rooms, whether or not it's actually important to try to manage those things, and ways in which engagement can be maximized in a virtual space while we are maintaining these social distance practices. And, you know, it's not an easy question overall, but I do think that relying on the strength of youth, relying on the tools that they already have at their hands, the technology that they utilize, including them in learning spaces as instructors and supports, are great ways to keep youth, are great ways to help other youth see that, you know, this is something that I can play a role in on any given day, and I can be excited about that. I can help my peers along the way. And so I think that those are really great ideas. And at the same time, I acknowledge that, you know, the online space, particularly for some, you know, veteran teachers who might have been here for a while, Zoom might be entirely foreign. And, you know, something that is incredibly difficult to navigate, as I'm sure there are many parents who are working through that as well on their end with their children during this time. So prayers up for everybody.
I think too, we can use, if we approach the Zoom room or whatever technology platform schools are using and say, okay, the first thing I'm going to do when I get into that room every single time is take the temperature in the room. And I noticed there was a question that how are you doing is suddenly a really loaded question. A psychologist recently said to me, the air is drenched with this amorphous kind of grief. You say hello to anybody and there's just this hesitancy. And actually one of my 7th graders came up with a great word. She says she's quarantine good, which really just means under the circumstances, I'm good. And I think that that is kind of the baseline, that we have to assume that at best our kids are quarantine good. And to answer that question in the Q&A box, I think one way that we can help kids not only express how they're feeling and have the language around what they're feeling, but support one another is to, and I've seen this done a lot of different ways. A math teacher I know did this by using a Google chart where he had kids rank how they felt on a scale of -4 to 4, which would be the last way I personally would choose to have kids rank their feelings because I'm not numerical at all. But for him, this worked. And then what he did is, so if -4 is you're so upset you're crying, and 4 is you're exuberantly happy, after the kids chose how they felt, he would have them circle up, and you would have to do this virtually since most people are remote right now. He would ask the kids to share why they chose the ranking that they chose. And it was a way to help them make the connections between their feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And so one example was the kid was crying because he had been running late and he had gotten into a fight with his dad in the car on the way to school, and he was super stressed, and he just was carrying that around. He hadn't unloaded it. So this teacher pretty beautifully gave him an opening to unload it. And then what he did, because he never stopped with just, why are you feeling that way? He opened it to the whole class and said, does anyone have any suggestions? Anything that he could do? And the kids piped in and they said, well, maybe you could take a few minutes and send an email to your dad and tell him you wanted to talk after work because you didn't like how the day started, so that you can concentrate for the rest of today. And another said, maybe you should use an alarm clock that has a couple of warnings so that you're not rushing so much in the morning. And the takeaway for all of the kids really was, it's normal to not feel great all of the time, but these feelings don't come out of nowhere, and there's something that you can do with them. And then he empowered this room full of, these were fifth graders, he empowered this room full of kids to help one another. And I think that accomplished so many different objectives. So whether you're saying what was the high and the low of this week, or what's something that was surprisingly easy and joyful, and I think we want to make sure we're not only harping on the negative, that we're also encouraging kids to hang on to the moments of joy. And some kids really are feeling relief. There was another question about kids who have no desire to interact socially. They're extremely introverted. And I think that we have to acknowledge that people have different needs. I personally, to answer that question, think that we should be ensuring that kids are engaging with somebody outside of the family, face-to-face, at least once every few days. And it doesn't have to be a peer. It could be an older neighbor. It could be a great aunt. It could be a one-on-one meeting with the teacher. We do want them, though, to be engaging with people and practicing those social skills.
Nancy, I know we're about to move on. I just want to acknowledge briefly, and we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think our comments are sort of assuming that kids are able to show up to school, virtual or otherwise. And we know from the data that there's a lot of kids, especially in the spring, who just, they were disconnected from school and schools were not able to connect back with them. So I think an important consideration for school leaders in terms of the transition is to approach this in a caring and non-punitive way, given what's happening with everybody being in lots of differing circumstances, understanding that there may be really critical reasons why kids are not able to show up, or maybe they can show up, but they would prefer to have a virtual background or not have their video screen on. And so I think understanding that for most adolescents, it's not because they don't care. And for most parents and other adult caregivers, it's not because they don't care. Recognizing that there are challenges that many young people are facing that will create barriers is another critical issue that I want to make sure just that we acknowledge it, even though we're mostly focused on those kids who are able to connect back with school.
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. And I just wanted to clarify one quick thing, Phyllis, when you said ensuring face-to-face, I'm assuming you mean virtually face-to-face or
yes.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
If it's possible and you're in an area with less disease activity and you can meet socially distanced outside, of course that would be ideal. But if not, yes, I mean either FaceTime or using Google Meets in some fashion.
So we're going to move on in a moment, but we do have a couple of questions that have come in that specifically relate to sort of what you've been discussing. So I thought I would pose a couple of them now. And you've been mentioning sort of the issue of having kids rate their feelings. And one question did come in about, given the levels of that Letitia, you were mentioning the levels of depression and anxiety, and that's probably also true for teachers. Someone asked whether we should be sort of testing teachers, administrators, students, either before they come back or on a regular basis, so that we have a sense of who needs support.
Testing in relation to mental health fitness or disease?
That is a good question, actually. I inferred, it just said testing from the question. Looks like Mr. Walter, you can clarify in the Q&A if you want to. I was taking it as mental health testing, but it does occur to me now that they may be thinking.
Well, I think similar to the way that we've been discussing the social climate for students, I think that teachers are going through the same thing. And I think that the same way that we would approach thinking about variability within our student population, we can have the same kind of notions approaching our teacher population and thinking through needs assessment. One thing to strongly consider is, what kind of social supports do teachers have as they're navigating through these new spaces, through this new way of teaching, through this new way of learning, and, how are administrators supporting community within teachers during this difficult time where there's a lot of social isolation or physical, during our physical distancing time. And so I think that testing in terms of, going back to in-person instruction would be necessary just for health and safety, according to our public health officials, but also thinking about mental health resources and support. So thinking about ways in which we can create supports around teachers, sharing resources, sharing ideas, sharing the ways in which they're engaging with their students in meaningful ways, thinking about how they're actually assessing the needs of their students and maintaining contact with their students and their families, and what toll that might be taking on teachers, because let's not forget that this is a time of grief and loss for many, and teachers are not exempt from that. They're human just like everyone else.
I was just talking to my head of school and had asked her how she felt if I were to offer 2 additional groups this fall. One is a drop-in support group for parents, and one is a drop-in support group for teachers. And, I would be very conscious of keeping it productive, constructive, solution-oriented, and really an opportunity to normalize that everybody is dealing with loss and grief, and everybody is dealing with the stress of feeling like you've got 5,000 balls in the air and all of them are kind of dropping and shattering on the ground at any given time. And I do think that given the fact that we know emotions spread through a social network, we know emotions are contagious. Our students are not going to do well if their teachers are not doing well. Our students are not going to do well if their parents aren't going to do well. And we have to go into this year thinking about the supports we can implement to take care of the adults in the community. There's a program, it's not new, I think it was 2016, and it's applicable for schools that are going back face-to-face right now. And it's called Tap In, Tap Out. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it was implemented to allow teachers to sign up to offer to cover for one another in the middle of a class session, in the middle of a lesson even. They could text one another and say, I need a break. I feel like I'm going to lose it on these kids, or I feel like I'm not going to handle this conflict well. I really need some backup. And what was fascinating about the Tap In, Tap Out program is that within several weeks of implementing it, and the teachers really did use it, the teachers no longer needed it in the same way because they felt supported, and simply feeling supported, simply knowing that somebody would come in and have their back, and it was a high need school, was enough to really meet some of the challenge of working with this high need population. So I think going into the fall for schools that are looking very different, those kinds of programming will be helpful for teachers, and also again, looking at ways to support educators. And I don't think that's adding on extra Zoom cocktail hours for most people. And so thinking a little bit more creatively about how we do that.
Thanks, Phyllis. I want to ask one more question that came up before we move on to the next theme. Because it has to do with sort of social dynamics, and it is something that has been mentioned a few times in terms of thinking about monitoring the breakout rooms. And that is that there may be some youth who are more at risk for being bullied. Particularly, we know that Asian American Pacific Islander youth may be, because of the discrimination in relation to COVID-19, certainly, as racial injustice and Black Lives Matter protests, there may be in some districts tension around that. So I'm just thinking about whether there are guidelines or resources for schools, and thinking about how in the online realm, if there are guidelines for how to sort of handle that and try to ensure a positive climate for all of their students.
I think that this would be one of those things that, similar to what we might have done pre-pandemic, what schools and classrooms might have done around setting norms and expectations. I think that becomes even more important, so that students have some scaffolding around what to expect. And again, involving students in creating those norms and expectations around respect, for example, is always a way to help them feel like they really care about it, and potentially can encourage them to be the ones who are, monitoring each other. So I think any of, school policies and norms related to bullying and discrimination need to be, they're not off the table just because kids are not face-to-face. So they need to be made explicit. I think educators need to model what that looks like, what it looks like to be respectful, point out when kids are doing that really well, in addition to interrupting those cases where there are challenges. There was one other point I was going to make, and let's see if I can pick it back up. Yeah, so I think that the kinds of norms that we'd like to see, I know. The other point is around curriculum. I think there's an opportunity here for thinking about, in the moment we're in as it relates to social justice. I think schools are now, some schools were already moving towards thinking about how their curricula could support social activism and social engagement and critical thinking and critical analysis of some of these social issues. I think adolescence is like, a great time for digging down deeply into this. So that can be tied in some ways to social and emotional learning curricula. I know there's some work by Rob Jagers, who's at Castle, the Center for the Advancement of Social and Emotional Learning, that is working on tying together SEL curricula with social justice sort of imperatives, so that young people are gaining the skills to do some of that critical social analysis. In my own work, so here in Charlottesville, today is the 3rd anniversary of the Unite the Right rally. And I have been writing a manuscript, the revisions are actually due today, about middle school students' experiences with that rally. And what we noticed in our analyses was that, and in the study more generally, was that middle school students were often lacking racial literacy. And what I mean by that was they didn't necessarily have the words to express their understanding of issues of race, ethnicity, or culture. And so it became a point of discomfort to actually talk about it because they were worried about saying the wrong thing or about offending somebody. And it wasn't that students were naturally inclined to tease or bully one another, but it was such like a hushed topic that they felt like, I don't really know how, I may be curious and I may have questions, but I don't even have the right words to actually engage in conversations or make meaning. So rather than assuming that young people have those skills, I think we need to give them the explicit tools and say, these are the things that are okay to say, or here's why, a question like this might, affect people differently, or, may not have the intended impact. So offering opportunities for engagement, whether or not it's in the context of the pandemic or, beyond, I think is really critical in adolescence.
I love that, Joanna. And I would add also that one of the things that fell by the wayside during remote learning in a lot of places, in large part because it just happened so quickly, but something we can look to reinstate for fall are affinity groups, which we know are so important, whether it's students of color, whether it's LGBTQ plus issues, whether it's religious minority, it doesn't really matter. I personally think that affinity groups should be driven by kids. So I have an only children affinity group during remote learning that I meet with, which has been great. And we're actually going to expand it throughout the school because only children are an affinity group in this particular time period. They really do have more greater sense of isolation and different needs. But I was going back to this idea of opportunities within the pandemic, within remote learning. I was talking earlier today to somebody who works with the European Middle Level Education Association, and she was telling me about kids in Zurich who, when they went virtual, they had already had a GSA in place, but it was relatively new. And they created a virtual conference that wasn't just for the kids in their GSA, but given the opportunity to connect with kids at other schools, they opened it and invited other adolescents from other schools in Europe. And actually, I think one of the things I'd like to do in the fall with our GSA and hopefully with other GSAs is to coordinate with the head of the Association for Middle Level Education affiliate in Australia and in Europe to give kids not just an opportunity to connect with other kids who identify in a similar way, but to see that there's this commonality across the world, which isn't an opportunity we probably would have considered pre-pandemic.
So Phyllis, that's actually a great transition to the next question I was going to pose to the panel, which is that I think we've tended to frame a lot of this moment as being about challenges. But I think there's been a number of points in this conversation where you all have pointed out opportunities that if we sort of are able to grasp them, right, we may be able to move education a little bit. And so I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to what opportunities this moment might have for middle schools and middle level education.
Well, for starters, we've now seen that we can all survive a season without standardized testing. The world still kept spinning without people assigning kids to 5,000 rooms and proctors and adhering to all of the laws around IEPs and 504s. There was no week lost of instruction to testing. So I think that is one takeaway. I think that we can also use a lot of the lessons from remote learning. I think it's fascinating personally who was comfortable on camera. And I'm not talking about because of things going on in their home, but who was just self-conscious on camera, or who could only tolerate it for 10 minutes and then they needed a break. And how does that translate to what it feels like to be on 24/7 in a school day in a brick and mortar building? I'm a big fan of the shadow a student exercise, where teachers have to follow a student for an entire day and draw some conclusions about their experience and what could be improved. I think that we should be doing that during the virtual learning period. I think this is an opportunity to see, what does it really feel like? We see some school districts that are coming out with plans that have kids in front of a Zoom 6 hours a day. As the parent of 3 e-learning kids, I don't really see how that is going to work without a lot of creative teaching and a lot of breakout rooms and a lot of time away from that screen to do other activities.
So in thinking about opportunities, Phyllis, I want to go back to what you said about affinity groups, because here I think I love the idea that you sort of they're driven by what youth say, the kinds of affinities that they'd like to explore. So as we think about identity exploration, I think that's important. And I think there's another opportunity there for thinking about older adolescents supporting younger adolescents through the process. So whether it be, affinity groups or academic learning, I think because you don't have to worry so much about, the logistics of transportation to get kids together, there are ways in which we might engage older adolescents in supporting their younger peers. I think particularly about the young people who would be making transition, so from middle school to high school, for example. Kids who've been in high school already for a year or two may have some, sense of comfort or familiarity, but if you were moving from like 8th grade into 9th grade, that's a big transition in general. So I think we can invest in having our older adolescents provide some supports. One of the things that I am curious about, and I think we should track, is how issues of discipline will shift in this virtual space. So we know historically there have been racial and ethnic disparities in discipline, gender disparities too. Students with disabilities tend to experience punitive discipline more often. And so I'm curious to know how that plays out when kids are not, physically coming into a school building. I think it's something where there's, maybe some potential optimism, assuming kids are able to show up, for teachers to really hone in on relationship building rather than taking, sort of a punitive approach. And not making any assumptions about what their students are maybe thinking based on what they see on a virtual screen. Another, potential opportunity is thinking about the timing of school. So just briefly from a biological perspective, we know that adolescents, their circadian sleep rhythms are starting to shift. And so I imagine many parents of teenagers right now, if there's the opportunity, their teens may sleep in really late in the morning. And for schools that traditionally start before 8 a.m., that kind of can disrupt this natural shift towards sleeping in late and going to bed later. So if we don't necessarily have to worry so much about, cramming, so many things into a school day, maybe there are some opportunities to kind of meet that like physiological developmental needs of adolescents, so that they're not having to I think for parents it could be challenging if there's some motivation lost by the idea of I'm getting up to get on a computer, then we might give parents a break by saying it's not going to start until 9 or 10 in the morning as opposed to 7:30 or 8 o'clock. So those are some of the things that come to mind initially.
I love that in particular because as the parent of 2 teens and a tween right now, I have noticed that in order to get that independence that they all so desperately want, they've turned into vampires. They've essentially reversed their circadian rhythms entirely, so that whereas before it was hard enough to get up for school, now they're up almost all night and sleeping really late into the morning because my theory is it's the only time they can get the house to themselves. That actually just prompted me to think about another silver lining and something funny that one of my own teens said the other day. I was sharing with him that a friend's husband was commenting that one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that kids have a lot of time to think and really get to know themselves and develop some self-awareness. And his response to me was, no one has to think this much. No one needs this much time to think. And I do think that a lot of these kids are reaching the end of their rope, but they've also had more independence than they're used to, particularly if they have to fend for themselves because their parents are working. And I wonder how that will translate going back to school. I think they're going to be expecting or needing or craving perhaps even more responsibility, more ownership of their experiences. And we can really make sure that we are involving them in generating class rules, whether it relates to a Zoom room or how we treat one another in the classroom, or later on, maybe cell phone policies. They've been spending so much time online, we're going to have to break them of that habit when they return to school. But really looking at how we can take the sudden they've all been forced to grow up faster all of a sudden, and they're more independent, and they are going to be a different kind of generation than your typical 12-year-old 5 years ago, and schools are going to need to adapt. And I think it's a positive that they probably will be able to take on more responsibility at a younger age.
And I want to just quickly note 2 things. So Winsome Waite, one of the attendees, and who we've also worked with here at YouthNext, just noted that there is actually a resource on discipline that shows a need for schools. It's called the New School Suspension, Blocked from Online Classrooms. So folks who are interested in that can look at it. And I know that there was also a question that came up about the issue with internet access, right? And that there's another form of being excluded from school for students who may be, I think the term that was used was internet insecure. Internet security, and that may also further existing inequities. So just wanted to put those out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. In terms of the discipline and the rules, and I did see that report about a school incorporating suspensions from Zoom classrooms, which I thought was crazy. The other rules that I've noticed people are starting to consider enforcing relate to dress code and what kids wear to their morning Zoom. And having heard my own child's Spanish teacher make some funny comment about his hair when he literally rolled out of bed and into her classroom, I think we have to recognize as educators that we are going literally into our students' homes. We are guests in their homes when we are teaching them. And I think we need to pick our battles very carefully and decide what's going to get in the way of relationship building, and much as parents need to pick battles with their kids, we as educators need to pick our battles. Does it matter if they're wearing pajama bottoms that we can't see? And if we got a tiny glimpse of those pajama bottoms or a spaghetti strap or whatever it is that the school wants to enforce, we could get into a whole debate about whether those rules are appropriate even in normal times, but do we really want to be enforcing those rules now online? I would argue that we don't. we want to be drumming up enthusiasm. I've been telling parents when I do presentations for parents lately that as the kids are making this step up, whether they're starting middle school, whether they're starting high school, or they're just going from 7th grade to 8th grade, we still want to be communicating that this is a big deal, that they are a year older, that they are more mature, that their teachers are excited to see them and can't wait to teach them whatever form school takes. And if you as a parent normally make a fun pancake breakfast for the first day of school, do that even if the dining room is your classroom, even if the kitchen table is your classroom. If you take a first day of school picture, take it anyway, even if they're learning remotely. If at the end of the first day of school, you're calling grandma to tell them how the first day was, we should still be doing all of those things to communicate that this is a new start and it's an exciting start.
Yes, and I'd like to echo something that was said in terms of thinking about two things. One, specifically thinking about discipline practices and the inequities that are sure to follow those discipline practices. I want to amplify something that Phyllis said, that when we are Zooming education into the homes of our children, we are guests in their home, and families might feel very vulnerable with that, and we have to respect that. We have to respect that some students might not want to have their camera on. We might have to respect that some students don't want to, show their homes to their peers, that some students might not be as vocal over Zoom, because of living situations, or, there are other Zoom education classrooms going on in the same home. And so I think that's something that we really need to think about. And not just that in terms of, and not just thinking about that for our students, but also thinking about that broadly in the way that we construct things like these breakout groups, the ways in which we do set classroom rules and norms, and definitely including youth in that. The other thing I wanted to touch on is celebrating our youth, celebrating our students during this time. That is a moment of opportunity, and it's very important for us to be able to continue the enthusiasm of education and connecting with one another through education. Yes, celebrate with the pancake breakfast, taking the photos, this is what Johnny learned today, can we talk about it? And, just continuing to engage in those ways that allow you to feel appreciated and seen, to allow them to be able to continue to develop in positive ways.
So I think we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. I wanted to ask a question that came in from the Q&A that I think builds onto some of what was being talked about, but almost in the opposite way, around thinking about when we're going into, essentially virtually going into students' homes, right? And a question was raised that was the reverse of that, which was that when talking about GSAs, for example, middle school is a time when youth are exploring their identities, and they may be exploring identities that they are not yet sharing with their parents. And how you think about balancing, so you could think about both the confidentiality of youth not wanting to share parts of themselves with the school, and you can also think about youth not wanting to share parts of themselves maybe with their parents. Maybe they're not out yet, for example, and how we can balance these. I'm curious about any thoughts on that.
I heard a really interesting idea recently that a teacher had recommended in a different forum of having a room in the school designated as a counseling space, where perhaps if it's safe to do so, a student who needed support could meet one-on-one, even outside, in a socially distanced way to connect with somebody in the school. So as we're making plans for fall, it may not be safe to open an entire school building. It may not be safe to put kids on buses, but it's possible, and I know some schools are attempting to do some meet and greets outside in small advisory groups, or it may be possible to have an affinity group meet on a blacktop. And I think that it will be driven by local rates of infection. And I agree with you that there are some kids for whom they would be unsafe if their parents knew that they were participating in a particular affinity group. So the more we can think outside the box about ways to offer some of those groups and one-on-one counseling sessions to kids who need it, but who otherwise won't have enough room in their home or enough privacy to do so, can still access that support.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to close with a question that came in actually beforehand about What are the one or two things that each of you would say that schools should be doing in this time of COVID? The one or two actions that schools should take on behalf of adolescents that may be different from those that they would take for younger students. So really zooming in again on the adolescents in this.
I think given the period of adolescence as a period in which things like, as I said at the start, exploration and social connections become really central parts, and as well as identity development and meaning making become central sort of factors in this developmental period. I think prioritizing those and understanding that those kind of psychosocial needs are paramount. And in some ways, if you're not meeting those needs, then the academic learning may not happen anyway, because adolescents need to have those needs met. And I think we can go to, particularly when we're talking about middle school and high school students, again, we can go to them to not only find out how they're doing, but also find out about how they might approach some of these challenges. That gives them an opportunity for agency that they need. I think the emphasis on having some spaces that are about, the academic learning, but also opportunities for social connection. Phyllis, I love those ideas of maybe small groups of students in a safe, physically distanced way, actually, seeing one another. I think those are central priorities that schools should put at the top of the list.
I love that. When I think about adolescence, and I think about adolescents right now, and I think about the fact that rates of mental illness have been spiking anyway. And we know with kids in this age group, half the time suicides are impulsive, and kids don't necessarily know the difference between the normal mood fluctuations of puberty and when they need support. And they're not good at knowing when they need to go to an adult versus when it's okay to burden a peer with what they're going through. And they might not even know they're in trouble. And add on top of that, all of these other layers of stress that we know are happening because of the pandemic and because of all of the societal tension we're feeling right now. We need to really be proactively helping kids understand when they need help, when it's appropriate to go to an adult. One exercise I always do with kids is to ask them, and I think all teachers could be doing this right now, to say, I want you to take a minute and think on your own about which adult you would go to if you were in a crisis. And I don't ask them to share it out loud, but I always follow it by saying, if you were unable to think of anyone, that's okay, but come talk to me and we'll brainstorm together. And I do that to not only normalize asking for help and to not only signal when it's not appropriate to go to a peer who can't handle such a big problem, but I also do that because we know that when kids are in the moment, in that crisis, and they're firing from their amygdala and not thinking clearly, I want that to be somewhere in the recesses of their brain. Oh, I know this is the time when I'm going to go ask Aunt Sarah to give me some help, or I'm going to ask my older brother, whoever it happens to be if they're an adult. So just prompting kids to think about who they would go to if they were in crisis right now, especially since we don't have eyes on them the way we normally do.
The two things that I would say to school administrators in thinking about ways to support youth, and that's the question, right? I just want to double check that I'm answering the right question. Okay. Put your mask on first. That's the first thing I would say. Put your mask on first. Attend to your well-being so you can support that in others, and encourage, cultivate, create opportunities for leadership, competence for youth. Engaging youth, allowing them to be agentic during this time, allowing them to speak their needs and assessing their needs will be paramount. Paramount during the time that we're virtual and in our transition to in-person.
Thank you. So thank you all so much. I know we're a couple minutes over. I appreciate you all hanging in there with us. There were some great questions that came in. Unfortunately, we were not able to get to them all. If there's a burning question that you feel like you really want to ask, please email us at admin@developingadolescent.org. And we can try to get a response for you if you feel it wasn't, there's a question that didn't get answered. We also, I think, put in a link to some webinars that Youth Next put together around returning to school with equity in mind, which isn't middle school specific focus, but it's focused on helping teachers and administrators think about the return to school in this moment. So those may also be topics. So again, thank you all. Thank you for your audience for your questions. Thank you to the panelists for your wonderful answers and discussions. We'd like to especially extend our thanks to everyone for joining us and to our co-sponsors, Youth Next and the Center for the Developing Adolescent. And for more information about both of those centers, you can visit our websites. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. And stay safe, everyone. And as Letitia said, put your mask on first.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.